The ballroom existed to impress, to intimidate without saying a word. Crystal chandeliers spilled light like liquid diamonds over marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected every movement. Men in tailored suits spoke in low, careful tones. Women smiled with practiced elegance, aware that every glance in this room carried weight. This was not just a charity gala. It was a meeting of power disguised as generosity. At the center of it all stood him. The Mafia boss did not need to raise his voice to command attention. He stood still, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, his posture relaxed yet immovable, like a predator that did not need to chase. His reputation preceded him into every room. People did not approach him casually. They waited to be summoned. Conversations bent subtly in his direction, as if gravity itself responded to his presence. He ruled through silence, through restraint, through the unspoken understanding that his patience was more dangerous than his anger. Beside him stood his wife. She wore an emerald dress chosen not because she loved it, but because it suited the image he required. The fabric hugged her frame perfectly, elegant without being bold, beautiful without being memorable. Her dark hair was swept into a smooth updo that would not invite fingers or questions. Every detail had been decided long before she stepped into the limousine that evening. She knew better than to ask if he liked it. Approval was assumed, not given. She stood half a step behind him, always half a step. Her role was clear: smile when spoken to, nod when introduced, speak only when necessary, and never long enough to shift attention. She had learned over the years how to make herself smaller without shrinking physically, how to soften her presence until she felt like background music, pleasant, unremarkable, easily ignored. People admired her from a distance, the boss's beautiful wife, elegant, composed, untouchable. No one noticed how her hands remained clasped in front of her at all times, fingers intertwined to keep from reaching out. No one noticed the way her eyes followed him instinctively, measuring his mood, anticipating his needs. No one noticed how alone she was while standing beside the most powerful man in the room. He spoke to other men in brief, controlled sentences. Deals were implied, not negotiated, a nod here, a pause there. Power moved silently around him, invisible but absolute. When someone laughed too loudly, his gaze flicked in their direction and the laughter died instantly. He never had to correct anyone twice. She watched him the way one watches fire, with respect, with fear, with the awareness that warmth and destruction lived in the same place. Their marriage had been announced years ago as an alliance wrapped in romance. The city had whispered about luck and fairy tales, a woman chosen by a man who could have anyone. What the whispers never understood was that being chosen was not the same as being cherished. She remembered the early months when she still believed silence meant strength and distance meant discipline. She had told herself that love did not always look warm, that men like him showed care through protection, not tenderness. She learned quickly not to ask for public affection, not to interrupt, not to reach. The rule had been established early. Never touch me in public. He had not said it loudly. He had leaned in close during their first major appearance together, his mouth near her ear, his voice calm and precise. The words had not sounded cruel then. They sounded practical, like a law of nature, like something she should have already known. She obeyed. Tonight, surrounded by laughter and glasses clinking, the weight of that rule pressed heavier than usual. The room felt tighter, the air thicker. She shifted slightly, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. It was instinct, nothing more. Her hand lifted, fingers brushing the sleeve of his jacket for balance. A small, unconscious gesture, the kind wives made without thinking. His body went still. Slowly, deliberately, he looked down at her hand as if it did not belong there, as if it were an intrusion. He did not pull away, he did not raise his voice. That would have drawn attention. He leaned closer, close enough that only she could hear him. Never touch me in public. The words were soft, precise, final. Her hand dropped instantly, blood rushing to her face as heat and shame collided in her chest. She felt exposed despite the crowd, as if everyone could see the correction carved into her posture. He straightened, resumed his conversation, and the moment vanished for everyone except her. Around them the music swelled, glasses clinked, laughter continued. She stood there perfectly still, perfectly composed, perfectly invisible, while something inside her quietly learned a dangerous truth. Luxury could still be a cage. And silence, she was beginning to understand, could be the loudest cruelty of all. The night deepened as the gala stretched on, and the rule that had been spoken in a whisper began to echo louder inside her than the music surrounding them. She stood beside him as the room revolved around his gravity, watching men lower their voices when he passed and women offer polite smiles that never reached their eyes, fear and admiration braided together in the air. She had learned to read these rooms the way sailors read storms, quietly and carefully. Because one wrong movement could draw attention, she was never meant to hold. She felt the humiliation long after the moment passed. It settled into her like cold water soaking through silk. Every laugh nearby sounded distant and unreal. Every compliment directed at him felt like another reminder that she was not present as a person but displayed as proof. Proof of his control, proof of his success, proof that even a wife could be shaped into silence. She kept her face calm because she had practiced this expression for years. The expression of a woman who wanted nothing and needed nothing and felt nothing. The Mafia boss moved through the crowd with deliberate ease, accepting handshakes, nodding once when someone spoke too long, dismissing others with a glance. He never looked back to check if she followed because he already knew she would. Obedience had become instinct for her and expectation for him. Their marriage functioned the same way as his empire, structured, efficient, and merciless to weakness. He believed chaos was born from emotion, and emotion was a luxury he could not afford. She remembered when she had once believed his restraint meant depth, when she mistook his distance for discipline and his silence for strength. In the beginning, she had admired the way he commanded a room without violence, the way men feared disappointing him more than angering him. She told herself that a man who ruled so calmly must love quietly too. She told herself many things back then because hope had been easier than truth. As the night wore on, she found herself retreating toward the edges of the ballroom, careful not to appear alone yet desperate for air. The balcony doors glimmered under soft lights, and she longed for the cool night to steady her racing thoughts. But she did not move without permission. She never did. Instead, she waited, watching his body language, the subtle signs that determined whether she could step away or remain frozen at his side. He noticed her shift even when he pretended not to see her at all. His eyes flicked toward her reflection in a mirrored wall, and his jaw tightened slightly. The signal was clear: not now, not ever. She stilled instantly. Humiliation sharpened into something heavier and more dangerous: resentment. She realized in that moment that fear had been slowly replacing love inside her, not fear of his violence but fear of his indifference, fear of disappearing so completely that one day she would forget the sound of her own voice. She thought of the woman she had been before him, the one who laughed too loudly, who spoke with her hands, who believed being seen was not a crime. That woman felt like a stranger now, and the grief of that loss tightened her chest. Across the room, someone made a toast to generosity, to legacy, to family values. Glasses lifted and applause followed. She did not lift hers. She could not bring herself to celebrate a lie. She watched him smile for the crowd, a controlled, measured expression that never reached his eyes. She suddenly understood that his greatest fear was not betrayal or weakness, but exposure, to be seen as human, to be seen as capable of softness. The rule made sense now in a way that chilled her. Never touch me in public was not about her behavior, it was about his armor. Affection threatened the image he had built, and she had been sacrificed to preserve it. The realization struck quietly but with devastating clarity. She was not his partner, she was part of his disguise. As the music swelled again and the crowd pressed closer, she felt something inside her shift. Not rebellion, not anger, but awareness. Awareness was dangerous, she knew that, yet once it existed it could not be undone. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and for the first time did not look at him for approval. She looked ahead into the glittering room and felt the faintest spark of something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Defiance. It was small and fragile, but it was there, waiting, and though she did not yet know what it would cost her, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Silence had kept her safe, but it had also been killing her, and the rule that forbade her touch had drawn a line she could no longer pretend not to see. Memory came for her quietly in the early hours before dawn when the mansion was still, and even the guards outside seemed distant shadows rather than men with weapons and orders. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing shapes in the dark, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to remember who she had been before she learned how to disappear, before silence became a requirement instead of a choice, before love became something that demanded obedience. She remembered a small apartment filled with books stacked too high on crooked shelves and the smell of cheap coffee in the mornings. She remembered laughter that came easily and opinions she shared without fear of punishment or correction. She remembered standing in front of a classroom with chalk dust on her fingers and excitement in her chest as students leaned forward listening because they felt seen. Back then her voice had mattered, her presence had weight. She had been more than an ornament placed carefully beside a powerful man. The memory hurt more than the cold marble floors of the mansion ever had, because it reminded her that she had once been alive in a way that had nothing to do with luxury or protection. She had chosen him believing she was choosing partnership, believing that his strength would stand beside hers, not eclipse it. She remembered how he had watched her in those early days quietly, intensely, as if studying a puzzle he wanted to solve. She mistook that scrutiny for interest, she mistook his control for confidence, and when he told her the world was dangerous, she believed him because love made fear sound like care. As the months turned into years, the transformation happened so slowly she barely noticed it at first. Invitations declined on her behalf, clothes selected for her tone of voice adjusted to suit his mood. She learned which questions irritated him and which silences pleased him. She learned that expressing joy drew attention and attention invited correction. So she folded herself inward piece by piece until the woman who loved literature and long conversations and messy laughter became a quiet reflection that followed half a step behind. The danger beneath the luxury revealed itself not through violence but through erasure. The mansion was beautiful, but it echoed with absence, rooms filled with expensive objects yet empty of warmth. She walked through them like a ghost, touching nothing, leaving no trace. The staff respected her but did not know her, and the guards acknowledged her presence only as an extension of him. Even her name seemed to lose meaning, spoken only when protocol required it. That night at the gala had reopened something she had buried carefully for years. His whispered rule did not just shame her, it awakened her. She understood now that the rule had existed long before the words were spoken. It had shaped every public appearance, every conversation, every step she took beside him. Never touch me in public meant never remind the world that I am human, and never remind yourself that you exist. Fear settled into her chest, not of him, but of what would happen if she continued living this way. She imagined herself 10 years from now still standing silently, still waiting for permission, still convincing herself that survival was enough. The thought hollowed her out more than any threat ever could. She realized that the most dangerous thing about the life she lived was not the power surrounding her, but the way it had taught her to accept nothing as normal. As the first light of morning crept through the heavy curtains, she made a quiet decision, one that did not yet have a plan or a destination. She would start paying attention again to the parts of herself she had abandoned. She would remember her voice even if she did not use it yet. She would remember what it felt like to be seen even if no one was looking. Awareness settled into her like a slow burning flame, and she understood its risk. Awareness led to questions, and questions led to choice, and choice led to consequences. She was still the wife of a feared man, still protected, still watched, still surrounded by power. But beneath the silk and silence something had shifted. The invisible wife had begun to see herself again, and once that happened, the luxury that once felt like safety began to feel like a trap waiting to close. The decision did not arrive with drama or tears, it arrived with silence so complete it startled her awake before dawn, when the mansion breathed in its lowest hour and even the walls seemed to listen. She lay still, counting the seconds between her own breaths, aware that this moment was different from all the others, because for the first time she was not waiting for permission to exist. She rose quietly, dressing in the dim light, choosing clothes that would not draw attention, nothing elegant, nothing symbolic, nothing he had ever complimented. The sound of the zipper closing felt louder than it should have, and her heart raced as if alarms might sound at any moment. She expected footsteps in the hall, the click of a door, the low voice that could stop her with a single word. But none came, and that absence frightened her more than resistance would have. The mansion that had once felt imposing now felt watchful as she moved through it barefoot across cold floors, passing portraits and sculptures chosen to project legacy and dominance. None of it belonged to her, and she understood now that it never had. Even the bedroom where she had slept beside him felt like borrowed space, a stage set dismantled by daylight. She did not take jewelry, she did not take gifts, she took only what she needed, because anything more would feel like asking permission after the fact. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale. The guards at the gate were half awake, trained to watch for threats, not departures. She walked past them with her head high, heart pounding every step, a rebellion wrapped in calm. No one stopped her because no one imagined she would ever leave. She realized then how deeply they had underestimated her, and how dangerous that assumption would become. The city beyond the gates felt unreal, streets stretching wide and unclaimed, sounds sharper, brighter, alive. She inhaled deeply, tasting freedom mixed with fear and something like grief. A car approached and she raised her hand without thinking, the gesture simple, ordinary, human, and when the driver stopped and looked at her not as an extension of power but as a woman alone, she nearly broke apart. As the vehicle pulled away, she did not look back at the mansion because she knew if she did, the weight of everything she was abandoning might pull her under. She focused instead on the road ahead, on the uncertainty that waited without protection or privilege. Every mile put distance between her and the man who believed silence was control and possession was love. He discovered her absence hours later when routine failed him, when the house remained too quiet for too long. Staff moved carefully, eyes lowered, sensing a shift in the air. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, scanning the space as if she might materialize if he stared hard enough. The untouched bed, the empty closet, the absence of her presence struck him with a confusion he mistook for anger. She had not left a confrontation, only a fact, and that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. He was accustomed to enemies who announced themselves, to threats that demanded response. This was different. This was a loss he could not command back into place. The rule he had enforced without thought now echoed in his mind, and for the first time he wondered not what she had done but why. Meanwhile, she sat alone in a small room that smelled faintly of detergent and unfamiliar air, her suitcase at her feet, hands trembling as the reality of her choice settled in. Fear washed over her in waves, but beneath it was something steadier, something undeniable. She had crossed a line that could not be erased, and the world had not ended. She did not know what would come next, only that returning was no longer possible. The invisible wife had stepped into the light without armor, without protection, and without permission, and somewhere deep inside her understood that survival would no longer mean obedience, it would mean becoming whole again, no matter the cost. The days that followed unfolded slowly, as if time itself was cautious around her. She woke each morning in unfamiliar rooms with unfamiliar sounds, and for the first time no one dictated where she should be or how she should move. The freedom felt fragile, almost unreal, like something that could be taken back if she reached for it too quickly. She learned to sit with that feeling instead of fighting it, allowing the quiet to become her companion rather than her enemy. She chose a small apartment on the other side of the city where no one knew her name and no one watched her arrival or departure. The space was modest, with creaking floors and sunlight that spilled through wide windows without asking permission. She filled it slowly with simple things: a kettle that whistled loudly, books bought secondhand, a chair placed by the window where she could sit and think without being observed. Each choice felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been locked away. Money became real in a way it never had before. No accounts opened in her name by someone else, no credit cards handed to her with silent rules attached. She learned the weight of each purchase and found unexpected pride and restraint. Fear lingered always at the edge of her thoughts, not fear of being found, but fear of failing alone. Yet even that fear felt honest compared to the polished terror of her former life. It was during one of those ordinary days that she met him, not dramatically, not with coincidence heavy enough to feel scripted. She was sitting in a small coffee shop scanning job listings when he asked politely if the seat across from her was taken. His voice carried no authority, no threat, only warmth and curiosity. She hesitated out of habit, then nodded, surprised by how natural the exchange felt. Conversation unfolded easily, without tension, without performance. He spoke about his work in education, about communities often overlooked and students who reminded him why purpose mattered more than power. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, without correcting, without redirecting, without measuring her words against an image he needed to maintain. Something in her loosened without her permission, and she found herself laughing softly at something he said, the sound startling them both. He did not ask about her past, and she did not offer it. The absence of expectation felt like safety. When they parted, he wished her a good day with genuine kindness and walked away without looking back. The simplicity of the moment stayed with her longer than it should have, not because of romance but because of respect. Across the city, the man she left behind was beginning to feel the absence she had carved into his world. Reports still arrived on time, loyalty remained intact, but the quiet no longer obeyed him. His empire continued to function, yet something essential was missing, and it irritated him in ways he could not name. He told himself she would return when fear outweighed pride, because that was how things worked. But as days turned into weeks and no message came, the irritation sharpened into unease. He ordered his men to search discreetly, not with force but with precision, because he did not want rumors, he did not want weakness exposed. Yet every report that returned empty unsettled him further. She was not hiding, she was living, and that realization disturbed him more than resistance ever could. Meanwhile, she began applying for work, rebuilding her identity one honest step at a time. Each rejection stung but did not break her resolve, because for the first time her worth was not measured by proximity to power. She was becoming visible to herself again, and that quiet transformation was more dangerous than any weapon he had ever controlled. The absence she left behind began to rot the foundations of his control in ways no enemy ever had. The mansion still stood guarded and silent, the halls still echoed with obedience, yet the air itself felt disloyal, as if it no longer answered to him. He noticed it first in the mornings when the house failed to move around him the way it once had, no soft footsteps, no quiet presence existing only to anticipate his needs. The silence that once felt like power now pressed against him like accusation. He told himself this was temporary, that she would return when the illusion of freedom shattered under reality. Fear had always brought people back to him, and he believed it would work again. Yet days passed and the certainty began to crack. Reports from his men arrived clean and useless. She was not hiding in fear, she was not begging for protection, she was simply gone, living somewhere beyond his reach without asking permission. Anger came next, sharp and consuming, but it had no direction to strike. He paced his study late into the night, replaying moments he had dismissed as insignificant, her quiet glances, her controlled posture, the way she stopped reaching for him long before he ever noticed. Memory became a weapon turned inward, and he despised it. He had ruled men who killed without hesitation, yet he could not command back a woman who chose to leave. At public meetings he remained unchanged, composed, immovable, feared. But beneath the surface something unstable shifted. He found himself watching other couples with irritation, with confusion, with something dangerously close to envy, hands held openly, laughter, unguarded softness, displayed without consequence. It unsettled him more than threats ever had, because it exposed a weakness he had trained himself never to acknowledge. He began searching for her, not with violence but with restraint, because chaos would signal loss of control, and control was the only language he trusted. Still, each failed blade chipped away at the belief that everything belonged to him. For the first time, he faced a truth he had never needed to consider. Ownership only worked when the other person accepted it. Across the city, she was rebuilding herself, quietly unaware of the storm her absence was creating. She moved through her days with caution but also with intention, learning to trust her instincts again. The simple act of choosing her own routine felt revolutionary. Fear still lived in her chest, but it no longer commanded her every move. When she ran into the man from the coffee shop again, it was unplanned and unremarkable, yet it shifted something inside her. He greeted her with warmth, not possession. He remembered her name without needing to assert it. Their conversation unfolded, easily rooted in curiosity, not control. She noticed how he listened without scanning the room, how he gave his attention freely without treating it like currency. The contrast between the two men began to sharpen in her mind, not as comparison, but as clarity. One ruled through silence and distance, the other through presence and respect. She realized then that what frightened her most was not the danger she escaped, but the possibility that she had once believed danger was love. Meanwhile, the Mafia boss stood at the center of his empire, feeling something unfamiliar seep into his bones: doubt. He had lost many things in his life: rivals, territory, alliances, but he had never lost something that chose to leave him. The realization gnawed at him relentlessly because it stripped away the illusion of absolute control. For the first time, he wondered not how to bring her back, but why she had never tried to stay, and that question followed him into the quiet hours, whispering truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The man who believed silence was strength was beginning to understand that silence could also be abandonment, and that understanding marked the beginning of a loss far greater than he was prepared to face. He saw her when he least expected it, in a room that was never meant to surprise him, a legitimacy gala wrapped in velvet and crystal designed to soften the reputation of men like him. He entered late as always because timing was another form of control. Conversations slowed the moment he appeared, heads turned then lowered, and the familiar current of fear and respect moved ahead of him, clearing space. He scanned the room out of habit, measuring threats, alliances, shifts in loyalty, and then his attention locked onto something that knocked the breath from his chest. She stood near the far side of the hall, bathed in warm light, laughing openly with a man who leaned toward her, not possessively, but attentively. Her body language was relaxed, unguarded, her hands free, no longer folded, no longer restrained. The sound of her laughter hit him harder than any insult because it was real, and he realized with a sudden violent clarity that he had never heard that sound while she belonged to him. Jealousy surged through him, raw and unfamiliar, burning beneath his skin as he watched the man beside her smile, not like someone who owned power, but like someone who shared space willingly. A hand brushed her arm briefly, not to claim, but to connect, and she did not flinch, she did not shrink, she did not check the room for permission. The image fractured something deep inside him, because it revealed what he had taken without understanding. Her fear had never been respect, and her silence had never been devotion, it had been survival. He felt the room tilt as the rule he once enforced with certainty echoed back at him: never touch me in public. And he understood now that the rule had never protected him, it had only kept her small enough to control. He moved before logic could restrain him, cutting through the crowd with a purpose that unsettled even his own men. This was not strategy, this was instinct sharpened into obsession. When she looked up and saw him, her laughter faded not into fear but into composure, and that composure wounded him more than anger ever could. She did not step back, she did not reach for him, she did not look at the man beside her for guidance, she simply met his gaze, calm, steady, unafraid. In that moment, he knew he had lost something that could not be taken back by force, because it no longer belonged to him. They stood facing each other while the room continued to breathe around them, unaware of the war unfolding in silence. He searched her face for the woman who used to wait for his cues and found instead someone anchored in herself. When he spoke her name, it sounded foreign in his mouth, stripped of authority, and when he demanded to know what she was doing there, she answered without apology, explaining her work, her purpose, her choice. Each word dismantled the version of her he had kept locked inside his mind. The man beside her stepped away, not in fear, but in respect, granting her space to speak for herself, and that act alone exposed everything he had never given her. Rage threatened to surface, but beneath it something far more dangerous took hold: recognition that he had mistaken possession for love, silence for strength, and obedience for loyalty. Watching her stand there unafraid and unchanged by his presence, he felt control slip through his fingers like smoke. The rule that once defined their marriage shattered completely, not because she broke it, but because she no longer lived by it. And as he stood surrounded by power, he realized too late that the only thing he had truly lost was the one thing he could never command back: her freedom. The space between them felt heavier than the crowd pressing in around them, as if the air itself recognized the shift that had taken place. He stood waiting for fear, waiting for hesitation, waiting for the familiar flicker of obedience that had always followed his presence. But none came. She did not lower her gaze or soften her posture or measure her words for safety. Instead, she met him calmly, and that calm unsettled him more than any act of defiance ever could. He spoke first because silence no longer served him the way it once had. His voice carried authority out of habit, but beneath it was strain, an edge he could not smooth away. He asked why she was here, as if the question itself could restore order. She answered, simply explaining the work she was doing, the people she served, the purpose she had found. Her words did not rush or tremble, they landed with quiet certainty, and each sentence stripped away another illusion he had built around her. He tried to remind her of what he had given her: protection, wealth, safety, a name that commanded respect. The old defenses surfaced automatically because they had always worked before. She listened without interrupting, and that was when he understood she was no longer arguing with him in her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice carried neither bitterness nor apology, only truth. She told him he had given her things, but never partnership, comfort, but never respect, safety, but never freedom. The crowd faded into a blur as her words reached places no enemy ever had. She told him the rule he had enforced so carefully had taught her exactly where she stood in his world and how little space she occupied within it. Never touch me in public had not protected his power, it had revealed it. It had shown her that affection was a weakness he refused to own, and that weakness had been her burden to carry. For the first time he attempted something unfamiliar: explanation. He spoke of danger, of appearances, of enemies watching for cracks. He told her softness invited destruction, and that control was the only way to survive in his world. She did not argue the logic because she understood it now better than ever. Instead, she told him quietly that survival without self was not a victory, it was a slow disappearance, and she had almost vanished completely before she realized what it was costing her. The man she stood with watched from a distance, not interfering, not asserting presence, and that restraint struck him with brutal clarity. Respect did not require domination, and protection did not demand erasure. He saw then what she had been denied for years: the right to exist without shrinking. The power dynamic he had relied on cracked under the weight of that realization. He reached the edge of something dangerous, not violence but vulnerability, and it terrified him more than bloodshed ever had. He wanted to tell her he could change, that he could learn, that he could make space for her now. But even as the thought formed, he recognized the truth she had already accepted. Change offered after loss was not love, it was fear of consequence. She told him she was not standing there to punish him or replace him or prove anything. She was standing there because she had rebuilt herself piece by piece, and she would not dismantle that progress for anyone, not even him. The words were not cruel, yet they cut deeper than rage because they closed the door without slamming it. He searched her face one last time, hoping to find regret or longing or hesitation, and found only peace. That peace was the final blow. He understood then that control had never made him strong, it had only made him alone, and the woman he believed belonged to him had chosen a life where silence was no longer currency. As she turned away to rejoin the man who waited without possession, the room seemed to tilt again, but this time he did not follow. He remained where he was, surrounded by influence and fear and power that suddenly felt hollow. The confrontation ended without victory, without violence, without reconciliation. And in that quiet ending he finally understood the cost of the rule he had enforced so easily. By demanding she never touch him in public, he had taught her exactly how to walk away forever. The truth did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly as the noise of the event faded behind them, and the weight of what had been said began to settle into the quiet spaces between breaths. He remained standing where she left him, surrounded by people who still feared him, yet for the first time that fear felt useless. His power had never failed him before, but now it could not reach the one thing he wanted back. He followed her with his eyes as she crossed the room, not hurried, not hesitant, her steps steady and unafraid. She did not look over her shoulder to see if he followed, because she no longer needed to measure her choices against his reaction. The man waiting for her did not rush forward or claim her with his body language. He simply stood open, offering presence, not possession. The contrast struck him with painful clarity, and something inside him finally cracked. He moved again, not with anger this time, but with urgency born of loss, calling her name once more. She turned because she chose to, not because she was summoned, and that distinction changed everything. They stood a few feet apart now, and he lowered his voice instinctively as if authority still lived there. He asked the question that had been burning since the moment he saw her smile with another man. Was this because of him? Was she leaving him behind for someone else? The question revealed more than he intended, and she saw it immediately. She studied his face with a gentleness that unsettled him because it held no triumph. When she spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen, and devastating in their honesty. She told him the truth he had been avoiding since the night she walked away. Even if the other man did not exist, she still would not return. The revelation landed between them like a blade wrapped in silk. His breath caught as the meaning settled deep and irreversible. This was not jealousy she was curing, and not loneliness she was escaping. It was the life she had lived with him that she could never return to. She told him she left because she had lost herself beside him, because love that demanded silence was not love, and protection that erased identity was not safety. He tried to speak, but the arguments no longer formed the way they used to. Wealth, power, security all sounded hollow, now stripped of the illusion that they were enough. She explained that the most painful part had not been his cruelty, but his unawareness, the way he never noticed her shrinking and never questioned why she stopped reaching for him long before he told her not to. She said the other man had not saved her and had not replaced him because she was no longer something to be claimed or transferred. She had saved herself quietly, deliberately, and without permission. The life she was building was not dependent on romance but on choice, and if she ever chose love again, it would be from a place of equality, not need. The words stripped him bare in a way violence never could. He realized then that he had not lost her to another man, he had lost her to awareness, and once awareness took hold, control was useless. His empire still stood, but its foundation felt suddenly fragile because it had been built on fear rather than connection. She looked at him one last time, and there was no anger there, no satisfaction, only clarity. She told him she hoped he would learn what he had taught her by accident, that power without respect was empty and silence was not strength. Then she turned away for good, not dramatically, not defiantly, but finally. He stood alone as the crowd closed around him again, and for the first time in his life he understood that the most shocking loss was not being replaced, but being left behind by someone who no longer needed to escape. She had not chosen another man over him, she had chosen herself, and that truth followed him long after the room emptied, and the night ended, leaving him to face the consequences of the rule that cost him everything. The city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the private wars that reshaped lives behind closed doors, and beneath bright lights. Yet for him, everything had changed. Even though nothing visible had fallen apart, his empire remained intact. His name still commanded fear, his men still followed without question, but something essential had been stripped away, and no amount of power could retrieve it. He returned to the mansion that night, and for the first time understood how empty it had always been. The silence that once obeyed him now mocked him. Every room carried the echo of what he had erased, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Days passed and then weeks, and he did not send men to find her again, because he finally understood the truth she had given him that night. She was not hiding, she was choosing, and force would only prove what she already knew about him instead. He found himself confronting memories he had spent years burying, moments when she had waited patiently for a glance, a word, a sign that she mattered, moments he dismissed. Because they did not serve his image, he saw now that every time he demanded distance, he had carved another wound and called it discipline. He began to unravel the habits that had once defined him, not publicly, not dramatically, but privately, painfully, questioning the rules he had lived by for so long. He realized that fear had been his greatest ally and his greatest limitation. It built an empire but destroyed intimacy. It commanded loyalty but suffocated love. And in that understanding, he faced the most dangerous enemy of all, himself. Across the city, she continued to build a life that belonged entirely to her, the work she chose, the people she allowed, closed the rhythms of days shaped by purpose. Rather than permission, she no longer flinched at loud voices or measured her worth by proximity to power. She had learned to trust her own presence, and that trust transformed everything. The man who walked beside her did so without ownership, without demand. He did not complete her, he respected her, and that difference made all the difference in the world. Time softened the sharpest edges of the past without erasing its lessons, and one afternoon, by chance, their paths crossed again in a small, ordinary place. A cafe filled with quiet conversation and sunlight. He noticed her first, as he always had, but this time the feeling that rose in his chest was not rage or longing, it was acceptance. She looked at peace, and that peace no longer felt like an accusation, it felt like an answer. She met his gaze and offered a small nod, a gesture of closure, not reconciliation. And in that moment he understood something he had never allowed himself to learn, that love was not proven by possession or control, but by the ability to let go without bitterness. She turned away and continued on her path, and he remained seated watching the city move past the window, carrying lives he could not command and futures he could not dictate. That night he made a decision not to reclaim what was lost, but to change what remained. He began dismantling parts of his world, not his power, but his dependence on fear. He invested in rebuilding rather than dominating, in teaching rather than silencing. The work was slow and often painful because transformation offered no applause. But for the first time, his actions were not driven by image, they were driven by understanding. Her story was no longer tied to his, and that was the greatest truth of all. She had not won by replacing him, and he had not lost because of another man. The ending was not about romance or revenge, but about identity. She had reclaimed herself, and in doing so taught him the most costly lesson of his life, that love does not shrink people, it expands them, and any power that demands silence will eventually be left standing alone.